Now, once we start to examine people's lives, of course, we have to look at the larger picture. Because no baby is born independently or could survive independently. Children are born into a culture, they're born into a society, they're born into an economic situation, they're born into a whole set of circumstances which they didn't choose and over which they have no control. So therefore, if you understand the experience of that child, you have to look at the society into which they're born and the history of that society and the current practices and mores and policies of that society. In short, we can't understand anything in isolation. We have to look at the connections. That's not a new idea. A teacher, the Buddha, 2,500 years ago, talked about the interconnected nature of phenomena. And this is what he said. Contemplate the nature of interconnected arising, which is that everything is caused by everything else, during every moment. When you look at a leaf or a raindrop, meditate on all the conditions, near and distant, that have contributed to the presence of that leaf or raindrop. Know that the world is woven of interconnected strands. This is because that is. This is not because that is not. This is born because that is born. This dies because that dies. The birth and death of any phenomena are connected to the birth and death of all other phenomena. The one contains the many, and the many contains the one. Without the one, there cannot be the many, and without the many, there cannot be the one. So when you look at that, it's a bit surprising to find out maybe that in this Notre Dame study, when they looked at the optimal environment for parenting, you know what they found? The optimal environment for parenting is the hunter-gatherer tribe, which is to say, the society that native people here had before the coming of the Caucasians. In other words, they had the culture that was best designed to support healthy child development. Because the natives didn't beat their kids. And to the Puritans, of course, you're supposed to beat your kids. If you spare the rod, you spoil the child. This is the ethic. So the idea of a culture that didn't beat their kids, they didn't understand that one. So, on the other hand, native people carried their kids everywhere they went. So the kids were never put down. They were never left alone. They were not isolated in kindergartens. They were not left to cry. If they were upset, they were picked up right away. In other words, they parented with absolute intuitive, instinctual, nurturing parenting practices. The essential condition for the proper development of brain circuits that govern our behavior and our emotional life. So brain circuits that govern our capacity to regulate our impulses so that we're not acting out all the time. Brain circuits that regulate our capacity to balance ourselves emotionally so we don't get too upset when something happens, so we can handle it. Brain circuits that handle our capacity to respond to stress. And other important to pay attention. All these important brain circuits need the right environment. And the essential condition is a non-stress, supportive parenting environment. Now if we look at society as a whole, and we see all these kids who are diagnosed with oppositionality, conduct disorders, ADHD, Tourette's, Asperger's, autism, all that, they all have stuff in common. What they have in common is poor impulse control, poor emotional self-regulation. So when they get upset, they show tantrums. They can't stop themselves. Poor social cues. They can't read social cues very well. In other words, all the things that FASD kids don't have either. And in all these other cases, we're not saying it's because the mother drank too much, because the mother didn't drink. What happened was that those children were born to stressed parents under stressed circumstances. And in those conditions, the brain didn't develop properly. They couldn't develop properly. Now, if you look at FASD kids, what do we see? Not only do we see that the mothers may have drunk excessively during pregnancy, but if we ask, why did those women drink? Well, we've already answered that. It's because the woman was in pain emotionally and she needed to soothe the pain with the drink. In other words, she's a stressed woman. She has a lifelong history of distress. And she's in a distressful situation right now. Maybe she's in a relationship where she's being beaten. Maybe she's in a relationship where she's not being supported. Maybe she's living with an alcoholic male. Maybe she's all isolated. In other words, she's very, very stressed. Stress on a woman during pregnancy has an impact on the developing nervous system of the child, physiologically. So studies have shown that women who are stressed during pregnancy, their kids will have behavior problems at age 3 or 4.